Listen closely, for what I'm about to tell you was never written to be read, nor spoken to be heard. It was meant to rot in silence, buried under ledgers, beneath acres of polished wood and candlelight. But silence is never eternal. The dead do not sleep when their story has not been told. And tonight, you will hear what no guest was meant to know, that in Virginia, in the winter of 1817, a slave woman named Esther prepared a feast that carried not celebration, but a curse, and the flesh of the master who defiled her. The plantation where she lived wore its grandeur like armor, columns white as bone, windows gleaming with lies, a house where walls swallowed screams and repainted them as whispers of order and heritage. To the guests, it was an empire of refinement. To Esther, it was a crypt with a heartbeat. They took everything from her, first her freedom, then her body, and then, what was most sacred of all, her child. Elias, the boy she bore after nights of forced silence and stifled tears, vanished into the shadows of his father's claim. No ledger recorded the theft, no priest named it sin. Only Esther's hands, trembling in the kitchen, knew the weight of what had been carried away. And from that moment, a fire began to burn inside her, not the kind that warms, but the kind that smolders beneath ash, waiting for a single breath to rise into vengeance. She worked in silence, moving between pots and knives, baking bread and tending fires, all while her mind sharpened itself into a blade. The other enslaved souls saw the change in her eyes, the kind of change that belongs not to the living, but to someone already crossing the border into myth. You see, vengeance does not announce itself with thunder. It creeps in like frost, invisible, until one morning you realize the whole earth has been bitten. That New Year's Eve was the morning of frost. The table was set for wealth, for laughter, for the future of men who believed themselves untouchable. And Esther, the silent shadow in the kitchen, held in her hands the one truth they could never imagine, that power can be devoured just as easily as it devours. The first slice of the feast was not meat, it was memory. The second was grief. The third was justice. The night before the feast, the frost on the fields gleamed like a burial shroud. Esther stood alone in the kitchen, her palms raw with salt, her arms trembling not from labor, but from what lay before her. She had unwrapped the parcel delivered under false smiles, and in its folds was the horror no ledger would admit, the body of her son, returned not as a child, but as meat. Do you understand what that means? The master had taken not only his life, but the sanctity of the bond between mother and child, twisting it into a punishment meant to break her spirit forever. But what breaks a spirit can also summon a darkness deeper than grief. And in that darkness, Esther found her purpose. The kitchen became a ritual chamber, not the clean, bright stage for silver platters and polished wine glasses, but a forge of transformation. Knives no longer served appetite. They became instruments of burial. Fire did not cook. It consumed, consecrating the stolen body into something beyond their understanding. She salted with care, not to preserve, but to bind the act with finality. Each herb she crushed, each glaze she brushed, was not for flavor, but for spellcraft. She was no witch in the way the masters feared. Her magic was older, more human, the alchemy of grief turning into vengeance. Around her, the air thickened with the scent of inevitability. Every strike of the knife echoed like a drumbeat in some ancient rite, summoning not spirits from the ground, but memories from her bloodline. Women who had endured, who had carried the unbearable, who had whispered through generations that sorrow can sharpen itself into power. Esther heard them, she carried them, and she answered in silence. When the overseer passed through the hall, he saw nothing but obedience. When the mistress entered to demand a report, she smelled only spice. None of them saw the ghost standing beside Esther. None of them tasted the dread thickening in the air like smoke before a fire. They thought her hands prepared them a feast of triumph, when in truth, her hands were weaving their undoing. By morning, the kitchen was spotless. Copper gleamed. Knives lay in orderly rows. The roast glistened as though crafted for royalty. And yet, beneath its surface, a storm was bound. The guests would not be served a meal. They would be served a secret so foul, so damning, that once it touched their tongues, it could never be unlearned. Tell me, viewer, would you eat if you knew what fed the fire? The hall glittered that night like a cathedral built not for God but for wealth. Crystal chandeliers wept light across velvet drapes. Music drifted from a quartet in the corner, their bows gliding across strings as though to soften the edges of a world built on chains. Guests arrived draped in silks and arrogance, their laughter spilling over goblets of imported wine. They saw themselves as lords of eternity, immune to consequence. At the head of the table sat the master. His voice carried across the room, commanding every ear, every glass raised in toast. He was a man bloated by power, the kind who mistook fear for respect. Esther moved silently through the room, pouring wine, placing platters, her face unreadable. To them she was furniture, useful, invisible. But invisibility has its price. It allows one to see without being seen. The feast began. Silver cut into bread, knives tore through roasted flesh. Compliments echoed like hymns. Exquisite, said one. Perfect, said another. The master beamed, raising his fork high before plunging it into the heart of the roast. The meat tore open, juices spilling like blood across porcelain. He chewed, swallowed, and smiled as though tasting victory itself. But Esther watched. Every motion, every bite, was a needle pushed deeper into the skin of her secret. The guests praised the tenderness, the richness, the depth of flavor that lingered like a whisper of smoke. They laughed, their teeth red with wine and grease, never pausing to ask what fed their delight. The master boasted that only his house could offer such refinement. Only his table could humble the senses so completely. Yet with each bite, the room shifted. The air grew heavy. A few guests coughed softly, not enough to raise alarm, but enough for Esther to hear. Their laughter grew louder, but hollower, forced, as though some part of them knew something was wrong, but could not name it. The fire in the hearth crackled louder than it should, shadows stretching unnaturally long across the walls. Esther stood in the corner, her hands folded, her eyes lowered. But within her chest, she felt the pulse of justice quickening. They were consuming what they had sown. They were devouring the proof of their cruelty, bite by bite, praising it as luxury. And as the master licked the last of the juices from his fork, Esther whispered silently, not to them, but to the child who should have been alive to see this moment. They will know you, Elias, even if it is only in the marrow of their bones. At first, it was only a shiver, a subtle thing, almost imperceptible beneath the music and chatter. One of the guests set down her fork, pressing a hand to her throat as though the flavor clung too tightly. Another dabbed sweat from his brow, despite the chill of winter outside. The laughter persisted, but the edges of it began to fray, threads pulling loose from the tapestry of indulgence. The master, flushed with wine and arrogance, raised his goblet for another toast. To legacy, he declared, his voice thick, booming across the hall. To bloodlines that endure. His words dripped with irony, though none yet realized it. The guests cheered, swallowing greedily, as Esther drifted between them with the quiet grace of a phantom. She refilled their cups, cleared their bones, all while listening to the rhythm of unease growing in their throats. The overseer was the first to falter. His laughter broke into a cough, sharp and ragged, his napkin stained crimson at the edge. He waved it away, blaming the wine, but Esther's gaze lingered. She saw it, the body recognizing what the tongue refused to admit. Another guest whispered to her husband that the meat seemed unusual, its richness unfamiliar, too heavy, too human. Her words were silenced by his glare. In a house like this, one did not question the table. The music faltered as the quartet glanced nervously at the shifting room. The fire spat sparks, casting shadows that seemed to curl and twist like smoke made of flesh. Every candle flickered as though struggling to stay lit. their wax dripping like tears onto linen white as bone. And then the child appeared, not in flesh, not in body, but in the mind's corner, where truth hides when it refuses to stay buried. Esther's son, Elias. His face flickered in the master's vision, reflected in the wine, in the sheen of the silverware. A boy's eyes staring back at the man who had stolen his breath. The master froze, his fork hovering above the plate. He blinked, but the vision did not fade, it deepened. The boy's lips moved, though no sound carried. Around him, the guests continued to eat, but slower now, their joy curdled into unease. Whispers darted between them, questions unasked began to fester. The master's hand trembled. He forced another bite, chewed, swallowed, as if to prove dominion over whatever phantom plagued him. But the taste no longer belonged to victory. It belonged to memory, to guilt, to death. Esther watched from the shadows, her eyes unblinking. The room was no longer theirs. It was hers. The feast was no longer a celebration. It was a revelation. The murmurs spread like cracks across glass. A woman gagged softly into her napkin. A man's hands trembled so violently his wine spilled across the tablecloth, staining it deep red, a stain that would not wash away. The overseer had excused himself, but his absence only tightened the air, as if the walls themselves were waiting for someone to name the truth. Still, the master forced the charade forward. "Eat," he commanded, his voice sharp, brittle. "You insult my table if you do not." But even his tongue betrayed him. His words slurred, heavy, as though weighed down by the very meat he consumed. He stabbed another piece with his fork, shoving it into his mouth as though to prove his will unbroken. Yet in the silence that followed, the sound of his chewing was obscene, wet, grating, unbearable. One guest pushed their plate away. "There is something wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. Another chimed in. "The flavor. It's not pork. It's not beef. What is it?" Their eyes turned slowly toward Esther. She stood by the wall, head bowed, hands clasped before her apron. To them she had always been invisible, but now invisibility became spectacle. Her silence screamed louder than any denial could. The master slammed his fist on the table. Plates rattled, glasses toppled. "You will eat," he roared, veins bulging in his neck. "This is the finest meat in Virginia, seasoned by the hands of my kitchen. You will honor it." But even as he spoke, his gaze betrayed him. He could not unsee the flicker of Elias's face in every candle flame, every reflection of polished silver. The guests stared down at their plates. What had moments ago been delicacy now looked grotesque. The sheen of the roast no longer glistened with promise. It oozed with something too intimate, too human. Their stomachs twisted, and though no one dared speak it aloud, the question gnawed at every mind. "What have we eaten?" A faint sound rose above the uneasy silence. A child's laughter, thin, hollow. It echoed not from the hall, but from within their own ears, as though carried by the marrow of their bones. The guests stiffened, eyes darting to the shadows. The master's goblet slipped from his grip, shattering across the floor, wine spreading like blood beneath his boots. Esther did not move. She did not speak. But her stillness was an answer, and in that answer lay the weight of a truth too monstrous to deny. The hall could no longer contain its silence. It pressed against the walls, suffocating, until one guest broke beneath it. "What is this meat?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "What have you served us?" His words trembled like a blade, daring to cut through the unspoken. All eyes turned to Esther. She did not lift her gaze. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Only a breath, a sigh that carried centuries of grief. Yet that silence was more terrible than words. It left the guests to fill the void themselves, and the mind, when cornered, creates horrors sharper than any confession. The mistress clutched her handkerchief, her face pale. "It cannot be." she whispered. Her husband gripped her arm, hissing for silence, but her eyes widened in dawning recognition. She had heard rumors, the whispers of women in the quarters, the unspoken vengeance carried in lullabies and stares. Now those whispers sat upon her tongue, metallic, bitter. The overseer staggered back into the hall, his shirt stained with vomit, his eyes wild. "It's a trick," he rasped. "A curse! She's poisoned us!" But his words faltered. His gaze fell to his trembling hands, and the flesh beneath his nails seemed foreign, as though it no longer belonged to him. He screamed, striking the table, overturning platters. But the guests recoiled not from his madness, no, from the dawning truth reflected in their own eyes. The master rose, his chair scraping back with a shriek. His voice boomed, desperate. "This is my house. You will not shame me with superstition." Yet his face betrayed him. Sweat poured down his temples, his lips quivered. He pointed at Esther with a trembling hand. Tell them what it is." At last, she lifted her head. Her eyes met his, eyes no longer of a servant, but of a mother carved from stone. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, each word struck like iron on an anvil. "You know what it is. You made it so." The words fell into the room like a curse. Guests gasped, some clutching their mouths, others pushing from the table in horror. The meat on their plates was no longer food. It was a mirror reflecting every cruelty, every sin of the house. They had not merely consumed flesh. They had consumed history, devoured proof of their own corruption. And the child's laughter returned, louder this time, echoing through the beams of the ceiling, rattling the chandeliers, as though the walls themselves rejoiced in their revelation. The master stumbled, his knees buckling. For the first time in his reign, his face betrayed terror, not of rebellion, not of loss, but of truth. Panic swept the hall like wildfire. Chairs toppled, goblets shattered, silk gowns tangled in desperate flight. The guests no longer saw refinement, only ruin. The table spread before them had become an altar, and they its unwilling sacrifices. Some clawed at their throats as though the meat still clung there, refusing to be swallowed, while others vomited onto the floor, their bodies purging but never cleansing. The mistress screamed, her voice piercing through the din, "We've eaten the boy!" Her words cracked open what had been festering in every mind. Gasps became wails, and wails became madness. Men of stature clawed at their faces. Women of pedigree collapsed onto the ground, their dignity dissolving into sobs. The quartet abandoned their instruments, the bowstrings snapping as their hands shook, their music replaced by the shrieks of revelation. Through it all, Esther stood unmoving, the still point at the eye of the storm. Her silence was no longer servitude, it was judgment. Her eyes tracked the master, who staggered like a man drowning, clawing at the table for balance. His lips moved, but no words came, only broken gasps, as though the weight of his sins had crushed the air from his lungs. He pointed at her again, desperate, but no one followed his gesture now. They no longer saw Esther as a servant. They saw her as the reckoning made flesh. The overseer, in his frenzy, overturned the great roast platter. The meat slid across the table, thudding to the floor with a sound too heavy, too final. The sight of it, its shape, its undeniable truth, drove the guests into hysteria. Some fainted, others fled into the night, their footsteps echoing like a stampede of ghosts. But the master could not move. His legs buckled, his body rooted to the ground, as though Elias himself had bound him in place. And then the laughter came again, not distant now, not hidden in corners, of the mind. It filled the hall, a child's voice clear, echoing against marble and glass. The chandeliers swayed as though stirred by unseen hands. The fire roared, its flames bending toward the table as if hungry to consume. The master dropped to his knees, clutching his chest. His eyes locked with Esther's, wild, pleading. But she did not answer. She did not need to. The truth had already been spoken, and the house itself was carrying out the sentence. In that moment, the feast was no longer theirs. It belonged to Elias. The hall burned with madness, though no flame had yet touched its walls. Guests fled into the night, their cries scattering across the fields like the calls of hunted animals. But the house, that proud monument to power, stood still, its heart beating not in its master's chest, but in the quiet figure by the wall. Esther did not move. She did not need to. The reckoning was complete. The master crawled on his knees, his hands smeared with spilled wine and grease, his eyes locked on the floor as if searching for escape in the cracks of the boards. He muttered the same word again and again, though no guest dared to comfort him: forgive. But forgiveness is not a coin passed from the strong to the weak. It is a light withheld, and for men like him, it never shines. The overseer, broken and raving, ran into the fields, his voice shrieking of curses and witchcraft. Some say he was found days later, his hair gone white, babbling of a child's laughter that never left his ears. Others say he vanished altogether, swallowed by the swamps that bordered the land. As for the master, his fate was sealed at that table. His body gave way beneath the weight of truth. Some claimed his heart burst, others whispered that he choked on the very meat he had forced upon his guests. All that is certain is this: he fell face first into the feast, his lips stained with what he could no longer deny. When the fire was discovered hours later, consuming the house from within, no trace of his body was ever found. And Esther? The ledgers say nothing. The records fall silent, as though the earth itself conspired to erase her name. Yet silence is not absence. It is echo. For in the quarters, in the fields, in the whispered songs of the enslaved, her story lived on. A mother who turned grief into judgment, a servant who fed her oppressors the truth they tried to bury, a woman who showed that flesh, power, and legacy are all devoured in the end. Even now some claim the land remains cursed, that when the frost settles thick upon the fields, you can hear a child's laughter drifting through the trees, and if you dare to feast in that place, the meat will taste too rich, too heavy, too human, for the spirit of Esther walks still, serving not supper, but memory. Remember this: vengeance does not always come with swords or flames. Sometimes it is served on silver, carved with patience, and swallowed without question, until it consumes you from within.